Hey there, everybody. Thanks for joining the Low Voltage Lowdown brought to you by trueCABLE. Today, I'm Don Schultz, and I've got Dave Harris here with me, and Michaela Moulton will be chiming in. We're going to be talking about Ethernet cable horror stories. So this is kind of a fun episode where we get to talk about our personal misfortunes or things that we've run into that are funny and maybe some people out there can identify with. If possible, we'll be passing along some pretty basic information about how to not repeat some of these horror stories because some of it is self-inflicted. So this should be a really fun one.
Welcome to the Low Voltage Lowdown, where we discuss everything that's going on in the low voltage industry. Sit back, get ready to learn, and happy networking.
I'm going to go ahead and start off with my horror story, and that horror story, well, one of my horror stories. And so the horror story number one, basically really know what cable that you're cutting before you go cutting it. Now I know that might, it might be common sense, but believe it or not, it's happened to me, and it's probably happened to a number of installers out there. So one day I was installing a replacement run of cable, and I did not properly tone out the cable in the bundle, and I accidentally cut the wrong one. And it happened, of course, to be a nice 200-foot run. And to add insult to injury, this particular run was an older style power over Ethernet or PoE run, which carried 24-volt passive PoE, which means that the PoE was being supplied by a switch, a $700 switch, I might add, that was transmitting a proprietary version of PoE where it's always on. And so you turn it on at the switch port through software, and it stays on. It's not like the new style PoE where the device on the remote end requests it and then only gets power unless it says, yes, it needs it. So these were, not only did I cut the wrong cable, I cut a wrong live cable. And even though it's low voltage, I wasn't in any personal danger. It was enough to kill a port on that $700 switch. So it was a pretty expensive lesson because the switch was full. So I had to replace that $700 switch. I had no alternative. Word to the wise, make sure you're toning and tracing out your cable bundle before you go snipping a Ethernet cable that's especially carrying PoE, to make sure you don't end up in the situation I did, which was replacing the entire run, having to run the new run, and then replacing the switch as a result too. So expensive lesson, but it was a rookie mistake I made years and years ago, but I thought it would be worth relating it. So that's it for my my horror story. Well, one of them.
Thanks, Don. Dave, do you want to start us off with the next one?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about optical fiber a little bit. trueCABLE doesn't actually sell any optical fiber, but that doesn't mean we don't know how to tear it up when we're in the field. So I'll tell you a little bit about how you can avoid that. First of all, make sure your optical fiber is always in its own pathway. If the optical fiber is in a cable tray or ladder rack with a copper cable, eventually people are going to install copper cable on top of that fiber. And the weight of the copper cable will push that fiber down onto the rungs of the ladder rack or the wire of the wire rack, and eventually damage the cable either by breaking it or kinking it. Since this is a process that happens over months and years, nobody will be there to take responsibility for it. So always make sure your fiber is in its own pathway, and that can be handled just by plastic interduct. That'll keep the copper off of it. And make sure that you extend that plastic interduct all the way into the vertical and horizontal cable controllers in your racks, because people will still push and force big bundles of copper cable in on top of the fiber if they can't see it. That's one way to tear up optical fiber. Another way I learned when it was quite a few years ago when I didn't know much and was just sent to the top of a lift with an end of a armored fiber cable, and given instructions to pull it across this big warehouse and factory building. So we did that, and we were too dumb at the time to know that there was a strength member inside that cable to use for pulling it. We just pulled it by the armor because that was on the outside and it was easy to grab. So by the time we got across the warehouse with that run of fiber, we had pulled about 15 meters of armor off the end of the cable, and they had to keep cutting back, and we had to keep re-pulling it across the warehouse for them to finally find the fiber on the inside. So moral of that story is pull by the strength member. And another moral is know what you're doing before you start. And one more story about optical fiber having to do with knowing what you're doing. This is a mistake I made this time, but I would have if they'd have let me. Another person on the site had the habit of working with cable, and when they needed to straighten it, they would fling it out like a bullwhip, and it straightens the cable. Many of us have the habit of doing that, but if you do that with fiber, it'll snap it. And I can't say for sure if it broke the cable all the way down or if it just broke it in a couple of pieces, but it was ruined just by that one act. So bottom line is fiber is very, very vulnerable and has to be protected, especially when it's around copper cable.
Awesome. Thank you, Dave. Don, do you want to go next?
Absolutely. Well, another horror story, and this is another early mistake I made. Although I could certainly make this mistake again. I doubt it, but it could happen to anybody, and it's probably happened to just about every installer. And that's where finding out that your cable is too short. And I've got a mantra that I have developed ever since I made this particular mistake. The mantra is that the cable, the most expensive cable in the world on a per foot basis is the one that is 1 inch too short. And boy, do I have a good one. I measured the drop lengths incorrectly by not taking all of the variables into account. I ran 10 category 6A drops, and they were all approaching the maximum permanent length of 295 feet. Most of them were 290 feet long. And I had a measuring wheel, and I measured vertical rises. I measured, horizontal distance. I even included service slack at both ends. But one thing that I did not account for that I do now is that all of these drops had a lot of turns in them. I mean, we're talking about a lot of turns due to the installation and the structure involved. So I didn't account for any of the bends or the turns that the cable had to make. And so by the time I got all the way out to the remote end where I'm ready to, terminate to the outlets, I ended up being about a good inch to up to a foot short on every single drop. And that was not good because it took quite a bit of time to install the cable. It was only me and a one helper, and we burned up 3 spools of cable and then found out that we had to yank it all out and then buy 3 new spools of cable, which was an expensive lesson, not only in material, but in time. Also embarrassment. So what I do nowadays is go ahead and use your measuring wheel or your typical gauge measurement method, but make sure that you know where your cable has to make a bend. And for every bend that's in those drops, for unshielded Ethernet cable, make sure you're adding 6 inches for every single bend. If it's shielded Ethernet cable, it doesn't bend as easily as the unshielded does, and you have to obey a bigger bend radius. So I would recommend adding a foot for every single bend that the cable has to make. So once I got wise and I started adding bends in to my calculations, I never had a problem since then. But that was an expensive and embarrassing lesson. So always account for not only the horizontal length, the vertical climbs, uphill and downhill slopes, but make sure you take the bends into account as well. And it doesn't hurt to add a good 10 feet to both sides of the measurement just to be sure that you don't run into a situation where you have to route around something else you didn't expect. So that's another horror story out of the way for me, one that I don't like to talk about, but I do because people need to be aware of that one. It can save you a lot of time and trouble.
Yeah, you're a lot more precise than I am, Don. I just automatically add 25 or 30 feet or so to my calculations because I just don't trust my calculations.
Yeah, that's the problem with being OCD. I don't like wasting cable, but at the same time, I'm really like OCD about it. And I tend to overestimate when I do stuff like that. So I mean, other people have better luck there, but I like to estimate it and then add like maybe 5% or so for scrap. But yeah, my OCD has gotten me into trouble. Let's put it that way.
Awesome. Thanks, Don. Dave, you're up next.
Oh, okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about suspended ceilings. I've done a bunch of commercial work in the past and have run up against a lot of these things. And one thing I want to point out that's easy to have happen is, well, at these grid ceilings, at the corner of every tile, the grid work itself is very sharp. That is the metal pieces that hold up the tile. And if you allow a cable to fall down into that corner while you're pulling it up into the ceiling, it will easily slice the cable jacket all the way down to the metal, all the way down to the copper, and ruin it. It'll have to be repulled. So watch out for those things. Keep a person there if you're pulling wire up into a suspended ceiling so that that doesn't happen. The good news is that if you're pulling a bundle at the same time and that happens, that only one cable in the bundle is the one that gets damaged. So you got that going for you. As you go above the suspended ceiling, as we all have to do, we descend into true horror because people leave stuff in the suspended ceiling. By people, I'm talking about so-called professionals. They go up there and they leave tools behind. I was very lucky once that I opened up a ceiling tile right next to a ceiling tile that had a caulk gun full of caulk, dried up, but full of caulk just sitting there. Could have fallen out if I'd chosen the wrong tile. So choosing a tile, how do you choose? One good thing to do is avoid opening a tile that's right next to a wall, because that's the tile that usually collects all the debris that falls out when you open the tile. I was real lucky once that I followed that procedure, because on the tile that was next to the wall, the one that I didn't open, was a piece of cut off pipe. And I had to remove it, of course, so I lifted it and it was very, very heavy. I don't know if it was lead or what it was, but it was strange metal that was extremely dense and heavy. It was a piece about 8 inches long and it had been cut at an angle, a very sharp angle. So what we're talking here is a very heavy, about a 5-pound hollow point arrowhead that's sitting on top of a suspended ceiling tile waiting to fall if somebody opens the wrong one. So that's a horror story, in my opinion. A horror story of the gory variety. But if that's not enough, if your horror comes in the disaster genre, then also above suspended ceilings is where fire stopping is supposed to happen. That's where cables go through walls above the suspended ceiling. And most technicians don't seem to know that if you put a hole in that wall, and that wall is a fire barrier, then it's your responsibility to restore that fire barrier to its rating. Doesn't matter what kind of condition that fire barrier was in before you got there. It doesn't matter if every single technician that came before you left a hole that was not fire stopped. So you see all kinds of things going on with technicians trying to push their cable through somebody else's fire stop solution, not realizing that they have to rebuild it after they push a cable through there. You see situations where previously incorrectly fire stopped walls have a new correct fire stop fixture put in place for a new cable that somebody put in, but they did not restore the entire barrier to its rating. And the thing is, it's the technician ultimately that has this responsibility. You're not only responsible for the condition of that fire barrier after you work there, you're responsible for the lives it's there to protect. And so in my opinion, now we're talking real horror.
Awesome. Thanks, Dave. John, do you want to start us off with another one?
Oh yeah, you bet. So this is a more recent situation that occurred to me. Uh, I visited a small hotel that was indicating that they wanted to install a new camera system. And so I was quoting the job, and the owner insisted that I make use of all the existing Ethernet cable that was already installed. So I'm like, oh, okay. So I hadn't been out to the job yet, but I did go ahead and estimate the equipment, the cameras. Also, it was going to be an all-in-one system, including Wi-Fi, a ubiquity system, basically using a UDM Pro SE and a UNVR. Very common small, medium business, even larger business equipment. So a lot of the cabling was outside because of their structure, and so with concrete walls and stuff that's all sealed up, it's difficult to run interior cable. So you really have to run it outside, then go in. So they were complaining, though, that they had all kinds of trouble, and the owner had previously attempted the installation themselves, but they got sick of it and just wanted a whole new system. So, but they were insistent, though, that there was enough cable up and they didn't need new cable. So I went out at the job and I took a good close look, and you wouldn't believe there was three big things that still stick in my mind about this one. The first one was that none of the cable that they ran outside was outdoor rated. It was all pretty blue riser rated cable, which was already starting to turn white and powder up. Well, yeah, UV light will do that. Also, water vapor can infiltrate PVC cable jackets, and then your temperatures go down at night, and then it can condense into water inside your cable jacket, which is no good. That was problem number one. Problem number two was that these people didn't know about solid copper bulk unterminated Ethernet cable. And so they had actually joined multiple 50 and 75 foot sections together with indoor couplers outside. And of course, the couplers were corroded and they shouldn't have. I mean, some of the channels involved, that being the full end-to-end connection, had upwards of 5 couplers involved. And obviously, that's going to kill your data transmission. To get 10 megabit out of it would probably have been a blessing, but it wasn't even getting that far. So they had a bunch of interior couplers that you shouldn't. I mean, couplers should be kept to an absolute minimum, no more than 1 per channel. But you certainly shouldn't be using indoor couplers outside. And that's exactly what they did. There's no weather protection on them. And then the third thing I found was that they were literally had used any convenient tie-off point available, including pipes, nails, hooks, you name it, to literally wrap the cable around and tie it like a bowstring for excess cable that they had. There were no proper cable bend radiuses. Cable was literally turning, making right turns, tied around pipes. It was insane. And I told the owner that the entire cable plant had to be removed, that it was no good, and that I would not guarantee the functionality of the new system using the existing cable. And it took a bit of convincing. I had to take a Fluke DSX 8000 out and demonstrate that every cable run that they had failed. And then I explained what was wrong. But it was definitely a horror story. So the entire cable plant had to be yanked and all of it had to be rerun. But you have a lot of people out there that don't understand about solid copper Ethernet and making proper runs and length limitations. And a lot of the lengths were over length 2 for the temperature. During the summertime, temperatures here in lower Michigan can reach 105 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, a lot of the cable lengths were 295, 300, 310 feet, which is going to cause excessive insertion loss as temperatures rise. So your 295 foot number for permanent lengths and 328 foot numbers for channels, that's all predicated at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Once you go above 68, your lengths get shorter. Otherwise, you're going to run into problems, especially during extreme temperature events like summertime. So that was definitely a bit of a nightmare, and took a lot of convincing to get this guy to do the right thing. But he was trying to economize, and that obviously wasn't going to work out. But it managed to all work out in the end, and he's a very happy person now. So that was probably the worst thing I ever saw that somebody else did, not me. This was something else, something that someone else had done to themselves, not self-inflicted on my end. So yeah, that's probably the worst one I've seen. I would recommend that anyone listening to this podcast go to our Cable Academy at truecable.com. A lot of the mistakes that I've made over time and a lot of the things that I've learned from my Bixby certifications and learning how to use a Fluke DSX 8000, that is all. I've literally done a brain dump into many, many blogs and videos that are present in there to help future installers, newbies, as well as maybe experienced people avoid some of the pitfalls that come with running Ethernet cable. It's not just like a electrical cable you can string along and do whatever you want with. There are some rules that you have to follow to get a good install. So hopefully you found this podcast useful and enjoyed some of the horror stories. Maybe you've got some similar horror stories that you could share with us. We'd love to hear them. It's always fun to hear. I hate to say it, but it's one of those human nature things where people sort of like love listening to other people's misfortunes. I mean, not bad misfortunes, but just misfortunes in general. And it's a good learning experience and it gives everybody a laugh. So good, clean fun nonetheless. So with that, I'm going to say thank you much for enjoying the podcast. Make sure you leave some comments for us. Make sure we'd love to talk to you. If you've had something happen, we'd love to hear about it. And with that, I'm going to say you have a great day. And from trueCABLE to everybody else, happy networking.